So it was a hot day in Caesarea Philippi, and Jesus, along with his disciples, are walking down this desert road. And they were walking down this road, and then Jesus, their rabbi, did what he loved doing, and that is he asked a lot of questions. Anybody here know somebody that asks a lot of questions? Anyone sitting next to that person? Okay, so Jesus loves asking questions, and he asks this question. He says, who do people say that the Son of Man is? Who do people say that the Son of Man is? And this is documented in Matthew's gospel document in the book called Matthew. And this question Jesus asked would set the frame or the tone or the foundation for where Jesus is going and the vision he's about to cast. Who do people say the Son of Man is? And his disciples replied, well, some say John the Baptist, some say Elijah, some say you're one of the other prophets. And then Jesus asked them, well, who do you say that I am? Which, by the way, I think that's maybe the most important question of your faith. Like, who do you say that Jesus is? Because everything about your faith will ultimately flow through your answer to that question. Who do you say that Jesus is? Who do you say that the Son of Man is? And I love Peter. Peter responds to this question as you would imagine he would by quickly answering first. He was like that annoying kid in elementary school who anytime a question was asked, he was the first hand up saying me, right? He was this over-energetic, overexcited kind of guy. And he says, I know you are the Messiah, the Son of the living God. And Jesus replied, you're blessed, Simon, son of John, because my Father in heaven has revealed this to you. You did not learn this from any human being. And he says, so now I say to you that your name is now Peter, which means rock. And upon this rock, I will build my church. Everyone say church. I will build my church, and all the powers of hell will not conquer it. Come on, somebody. That's a good line from Jesus. He says, I will build my church, and the powers of hell, the gates of hell, will not conquer it. In some translations, it says gates of hell, which I should tell you, by the way, that gates are a defensive mechanism. And you should know that if you're a follower of Jesus, hell is not playing offense, but hell is playing defense because Jesus conquered death on that cross 2,000 years ago. See, I think it's so important that we understand that we're living from victory, not for victory. Jesus is not bloodied and beat up in the corner. He's already won the battle. Hell just hasn't realized it yet. And even the gates of hell can't keep heaven out. Cool. 2 people get what I'm talking about. That's great. And so I think it is so important that we understand that. I remember many years ago. Do you guys remember when the movie The Da Vinci Code came out? That was so many years ago. And I remember I was kind of a new pastor at that point. I was sitting in a room full of pastors. And I remember this one pastor standing up and saying, friends, we need to understand that the Da Vinci Code is the greatest threat to Christianity we have ever seen. Do you remember this, Jenna? And I sat there. I'm like, Tom Hanks? Really? It's the greatest threat we've ever seen to Christianity. What this pastor was failing to realize is that Jesus had already won. He was already victorious, and we can storm the gates of hell with a squirt gun because we're on Team Jesus, and death didn't kill Jesus. Jesus killed death. That's why it's good news. And so Jesus, he casts this vision that I am building my what? Church. And all the powers of hell will not conquer it. Now, we have no record to indicate that the disciples said anything in response. They actually, according to Matthew, didn't say anything in response. I think that's interesting. And I think they didn't respond to Jesus for maybe one of 2 reasons. Maybe the first reason is they didn't actually understand what Jesus was talking about. And so Matthew was hearing Jesus say, I'm going to build my church and the powers of hell will not conquer it. And he's like, that sounds important. I'm going to jot that down because maybe we'll need that later. So maybe there's that. That's why they didn't respond. Or maybe the second reason they didn't respond was because they actually understood fully what Jesus was saying. And the vision that he was just casting to them was so unbelievable, so laughable, so ridiculous, that maybe they were just embarrassed to admit out loud that they thought Jesus was being overly dramatic. And maybe the reason that when we read that verse and we're not pumping our fists and chest bumping one another and cheering is because we're the ones who actually don't understand what Jesus was saying when he said, I'm going to build my church and the powers of hell will not conquer it. Now, you'll never know why this moment would have left the disciples speechless if you don't understand what Jesus was actually saying in the first place. And unfortunately, the translation that we have in all of our Bibles doesn't really help us out that much. Because in all of our Bibles, it will say that Jesus says, upon this rock, I will build my what? Church. I will build my church. And the problem with that word church, though, is chances are when you think of the word church, that word is hyperlinked to an idea of a place. That every time you think of the word church, you think of church as, well, I go to church. I attend a church. I drink good coffee from the baristas at church. Come on, can we give it up for our brew crew who makes it happen every week? Or you think, well, I left a church so I could attend another church. Chances are when you think of church, you think of a place. But when Jesus said to his disciples in this desert hot day in Caesarea Philippi, he says, I'm going to build my ecclesia, which doesn't mean building or location or place, but it actually means gathering. Jesus says, upon this rock I will build my ecclesia. I will build my gathering. Now, the problem with the word church is that the New Testament was written in the Greek. And the problem with the word church is the word church comes from a German word. And that comes from another German word, which comes from a Danish word, that actually comes from a Saxon word, which comes from an entirely different Greek word. If you want to follow the etymological path to where it came from, you would find it comes all the way back to a very random Greek word that means house of God or place of God. But there was once a person who saw the word that Jesus was using and realized that this word church actually missed the vision that Jesus was casting for his 12 disciples that would have left them speechless. There was a man named William Tyndale. His picture, his mug is right here on the screen. There's this man named William Tyndale who translated the first English translation of the Bible. And when he came to this verse that we just read together, that Jesus was going to build this ecclesia, his gathering, he realized Jesus was never talking about a physical place. He was never talking about an event. He was never talking about a service, which is what many of us think about when we read of the word church. What Jesus was predicting in Caesarea Philippi was not that God was going to build a place, but that God was going to build a people. That God was going to build a movement of people. And this movement of people was going to be unshakable. And this movement of people, not even the powers of hell would be able to destroy it. But the problem was, in the 16th century, when William Tyndale translated the first Bible into the English translation, and he said, no, it's not about the church, it's about the people. Jesus didn't predict a place, he predicted a people. The Roman church did not like that at all. Because the Roman church thrived off of the power that it had being the church. But then you had William Tyndale say, no, the power actually belongs to the people. And they're like, well, that's problematic because we need the power to stay within the institution of the church. So we're going to just stick with church. And William Tyndale said, nuh-uh. I'm pretty sure that's what he said. He said, nuh-uh, that's not what Jesus said. So they arrested William Tyndale. And they strangled him. And they burned his body. And our Bibles have read church ever since. But William Tyndale was right. Because the word Jesus used, the vision Jesus was conveying here to his disciples, was not a vision about a place. It was a vision about a people. I'll say it again. In Caesarea Philippi, when Jesus said, upon this rock I will build my church, build my ecclesia, he was not talking about a program, an event, a service. Jesus was predicting not a place. Jesus was predicting a people. And he predicts a people, and he says, these people, they will have a lot not in common, but they will have me in common. They will have the resurrection in common. And he says that even the powers of hell will not be able to conquer this movement. And Jesus' disciples had to have stood there and heard Jesus say, I'm building this movement that's going to reach the corners of the earth, and not even hell will conquer this movement. And you can imagine these 12 disciples are thinking to themselves, really? Like, how are we going to do that? There's only 12 of us, Jesus, and I don't know if you've noticed, but people don't take us that seriously. And I don't know if you've noticed this either, Jesus. People don't like you a whole lot. They've tried to kill you multiple times, and you're trying to tell us that you're going to build a people, a movement that not even the gates of hell or the powers of hell will conquer? Are you sure? But as unbelievable as it sounded to those 12, Jesus was right. That is exactly what happened. For example, when Peter, the disciple of Jesus, took the message of Jesus to Rome, nobody knew who Peter was. Do you know who the emperor was during the time that Peter took the message of Jesus to Rome? If you know, just say it. Yeah, nobody, okay? So nobody knows now that it was Emperor Claudius who was the emperor of Rome during the time which Peter brought the message of Jesus. Why am I bringing this up? Because when Peter went to Rome, everyone knew Claudius, but no one knew Peter. And 2,000 years later, no one knows Claudius, but everyone knows Peter. And Claudius is now a footnote on the Christian story. And Jesus predicted it. Jesus said, look, this movement is going to go to the corners of the earth. This ecclesia, this gathering, these people that I'm raising up, you are going to storm the gates of hell, and hell will not be able to conquer it. This is the story you're a part of if you're a follower of Jesus. It's more than a Sunday service. It's more than a program. It's a people. It's a people that Jesus envisioned being built and would be unshakable here and now. And it all began 2,000 years ago. And this movement that began 2,000 years ago was this ragtag movement of misfits who had nothing in common. This movement that was originally called the Way. It was made up of merchants and of slaves and of former prostitutes and tax collectors and Roman centurions. And that doesn't quite hit close to home, but let's just imagine a new church started here in San Francisco, and on the board of that new church was your landlord, a homeless person, a former stripper, an IRS agent, and Vladimir Putin. Who's betting on that church to succeed? Right? It was a group of people that when you looked at them on the outside, you would not be betting on that church to succeed. And yet, this is where the church began. And so it makes sense then that when Jesus says, I'm predicting a people, not a place, and these people are going to reach the ends of the earth and not even hell will stop it. But these people will have so many things not in common, but they're going to share one thing in common, and that is the empty tomb. It makes sense then that one of Jesus' final prayers is that we would be unified. It makes sense that if he's saying, hey, look, what I'm building is not a program or a place, but a people that are going to be very different but share me in common. It makes sense then that Jesus says, you know, the thing they need most is unity. And I don't know about you, but I still think we need some unity in the church today. Are you with me? All I have to do is look at Facebook for 5 minutes, and I realize that Jesus' prayer is still relevant for us today. We need unity. As a matter of fact, it was one of the last prayers Jesus prayed for all future disciples. Jesus in John chapter 17, he prays, he says this. He says, I'm praying not only for these disciples, but for all who will ever believe in me through their message. Isn't it awesome to know that Jesus 2,000 years ago prayed for you? He prayed for your future. He prayed for you, and this is what he prays for. He didn't say, may their services be awesome. May their programs be flawless. May their musicians never strum the wrong chord. And may their kids' programs never, have things bad happen or anything like that. He says, I pray. Your kids are safe, by the way. I pray. This is a very bad example. I pray that they will all be one. Everyone say one. I pray that they will all be one, just as you and I are one, as you are in me, Father, and I am in you, and may they be in us so that the world will believe you sent me. I mean, think about it. If you have one final prayer, what are you praying for? Probably the most important thing that's near and dear to your heart. And in Jesus, one of his final moments prior to being arrested, one of his final prayers is, God, let them be one. And Jesus actually goes as far as to say that it is their unity that will make the invisible God visible to the world. And you should understand that God's mission is that the whole world would know him and see him and encounter his love and the life that he brings. And so if his mission is to be seen by the world and our unity makes God visible to the world, then we need to understand that unity is mission critical for us as the church. That unity is mission critical, and disunity disrupts the mission. And the mission that God has sent us on depends on us getting unity right. Because if Jesus meant what he prayed, then what this means is if we don't get unity right, it doesn't matter what else we get right. We could get all of our doctrine in order. We could have the greatest of programs. We can have great church services. But if we don't get unity right, we were successful at all the things that didn't matter most. See, Jesus says, let them be united. For when they're united, just as you, God, and I are one, and they are one, then the world will see and believe that you sent me. Our unity is mission critical. Our unity makes the invisible God visible to the world. Now, I don't know what you believe about the devil. That's probably an entirely different sermon series in and of itself. But let me just say this. If I were the devil and I could not get the church to hate God, I'll go for the next best thing, and that is to get the church to hate each other. Like if I couldn't get the followers of Jesus to hate God, I'll just go for the next best thing. I'll get them to hate each other. I'll get them to compete with each other. I'll get them to eat their own. Because I know if I could break their unity, I'll blur their mission. That if I could break their unity, I'll blur their mission. So what does this unity look like with skin on? What does this unity look like lived out? Luckily, Jesus didn't leave us hanging. In John chapter 13, in this gospel document, John, an eyewitness account to Jesus, he says this in verse 34 of John 13. John says this, that Jesus said, so now I'm giving you a new commandment. Love each other. Just as I've loved you, you should love each other. Your love for one another will prove to the world that you are my disciples. Isn't that awesome? Jesus says, look, here's the new commandment. Love each other. Now, some of you are hearing that, you're like, Jesus didn't invent the idea of loving one another, so why is this a new command? Well, you got to read the entire statement. Jesus said, love each other just as I have loved you. And these disciples were about to get a front row seat to their Jesus being crucified on the cross for the sins and for the sake of all humanity. So Jesus was calling them from the golden rule, love your neighbor as yourself, to the platinum rule, to love other people just as Jesus has loved you. To love one another just as Jesus loved you. This is more than a call to just be nice. This is more than just putting up with one another. This is more than spotting that person money for lunch when they forgot their wallet after service today. Like, this is more than that. What these disciples would soon discover is that the love that Jesus was calling them to extend to one another was the sort of love that lays down its life for one another. Because that's what exactly Jesus did. And he says, if we're going to be the people, the ecclesia, the movement that he's building, that the gates of hell will not conquer, then we're going to have to be unified. And what does it look like to be unified? Jesus says, you're going to have to love one another just as I have loved you. And that sounds awesome, right? When we're talking about the person that you find easy to love. But what about the person that's very, very difficult for you to love? You know, what about the person you hate? What about the person you've tried to avoid here at Canvas for the past 5 weeks? What about the person, not just who votes like you, but what about the person who votes very differently than you? You know, this is easy when it comes to people who read the Bible just like you and walk away with the same convictions. But what do you do about the person who loves Jesus, reads the same Bible, and walks away with different convictions? Can you love them as well? See, this is easy when it comes to Warriors fans, but Lakers fans, come on, Jesus, help me. Like, I need him to work in my heart. I don't know. Jesus never promised this love would be easy. It wasn't easy for him. But can you imagine if all of us in this room, we got this right? What if we got this right? What if we got a lot of things wrong, but we got this right? We got, hey, you know what? I'm going to love you just as Jesus loved you, and just as Jesus loves me, and he died for me. So you know what? I'm going to lay down my life, my preferences, my comfort, even some of my convictions, because at the end of the day, Jesus doesn't love me, because I've earned it. He's loved me in spite of me in a lot of ways. He loved me because he sees who I am underneath all the other stuff. See, what does it look like to love one another like Jesus loves you? And what would happen in this church, what would happen in this city if we got this right? And you could argue that the rest of the New Testament is really this documentary of the church learning how to love one another better. You could argue that the rest of the New Testament is the early church one anothering one another, just as Jesus called us to. As a matter of fact, we see it, I'll have it here on the screen. It says they forgave one another. They accepted one another. They cared for one another. They encouraged one another. What if we did those things really well? We forgave, we accepted, we cared, we encouraged one another. And if I saw it earlier, there's like an acronym here that would be the perfect series that says FACE, because real life happens when we face one another. That real love happens when we look one another in the eyes. That the vision that Jesus had for his church was not us being in rows, but us being in circles, facing one another, sharing life with one another. Man, that's a sermon series. I'm going to do that later. But we need to forgive one another, accept one another, care for one another, encourage one another. And then we have even more here on the next slide. It says they submitted to one another, they bared with one another, they restored one another, they carried one another's burdens, and they loved one another. There's no series in this one. It's a weird acronym, SPIRKLE. So we're not going to be doing that. No SPIRKLE series. But the content is just as powerful. What if we just one another really well? I see so many issues going on over the kind of music we're playing on stage, and whether that preacher preaches exegetically or topical, or are we doing hymns or not doing hymns? And there are literally churches that divide over such conversations, and we have to be better than that, church. We have to be better than that. We have to maybe disagree on some things, but we agree on the main thing. Jesus is alive, the world is being made new, and we get to be a part of it here and now. What if we just one another really well? See, the early church didn't have a building. They couldn't gather like we do. They didn't even have a Bible as we know it for nearly the first 400 years of this movement. All they had was one another. All they could do for the first 4 centuries was one another as well as possible. And if you're here and you're thinking to yourself, well, is that really enough? Can that really change the world? Do you really believe that? Yeah, I do. I do, because when the early church did this, it was enough to turn them into a head-turning, jaw-dropping, mind-blowing movement that disrupted one of history's greatest empires, the Roman Empire, and it changed the world. So how do we do this? God is raising up a people here in San Francisco and across the world that the gates of hell will not conquer. He's prayed for us to be united as one, to commit to what we have in common, which is Jesus, to love one another, forgive one another, bear with one another, walk with one another, care for one another, restore one another, to one another well. What does it look like, though, to do this? Well, the first reality that we got to understand is this, that it's going to require you being unselfish, because unity is unselfish. Unity is unselfish. You can't be selfish and also want unity at the same time. See, Jesus calls us to one another with the love of Jesus. And although many think that the opposite of love is hate, the opposite of love is not hate. The opposite of love is selfishness. It's choosing I above us. It's choosing me above we. Adam and Eve in the garden, they didn't choose hate over love. They chose self over love. We see the first murder in the Genesis narrative, in Genesis chapter 4, when Cain takes the life of his brother Abel. And God speaks to Cain. And he asks Cain this question, where is your brother Abel? And Cain responds with this phrase, this response that's cold and it's haunting almost. He says this, am I my brother's keeper? And of course we have the Genesis narrative because Moses, the writer, is trying to show the nation of Israel what it looks like to be human. So there's this question underneath the statement of Cain. And that question is, are we all our brother's keeper? And the answer is yes. You are your brother's keeper. We are all our brothers and sisters' keeper. And when we forget this, we are no longer building what God is building. When we believe that our responsibility is only to a select few as opposed to the entire world, we are not building what God is building anymore. See, unity and selfishness, they're incompatible. Unity at times will require you giving up what you want for what everyone else needs. See, unity is uncomfortable, but you should also get ready to, it's unselfish, but also unity is uncomfortable. If you're going to fight for unity and strive for unity, if we are going to be a united church, there are going to be times where our unity is uncomfortable. If you say you want unity, but you don't want to be uncomfortable, then chances are you don't want unity. What you actually want is uniformity. And Jesus never prayed for uniformity. He never prayed that we would agree on all things at all the times. He never prayed for rightness. He prayed for oneness. So Jesus, not being after uniformity, is after something much greater, much more powerful, and that is unity. And the issue with unity is that it is uncomfortable, which is why Jesus I imagine, prays that we would accomplish this because he knew how difficult of a task it was going to be. I love what Paul says in Colossians chapter 3. Paul says this, "Since God chose you to be the holy people he loves, you must clothe yourselves with tenderhearted mercy, kindness, humility, gentleness, and patience. Make allowance for each other's faults and forgive anyone who offends you. Remember, the Lord forgave you, so you must forgive others. Above all, clothe yourselves with love, which binds us all together in perfect harmony. And let the peace that comes from Christ rule in your hearts. For as members of one body," everyone say one body, "you are called to live in peace and always be thankful." Do you know why Paul writes that we need to clothe ourselves with love? Because sometimes we're not going to want to love those in our community. And sometimes it's going to be difficult to love one another in our community. Loving one another that we don't really love is like dressing up. It takes intentionality, it takes focus. It's not always the easiest thing to do, whereas bitterness is like throwing on sweatpants, you know? Like, it's not a good look, but you're pretty comfortable, right? And for a lot of us, it's like bitterness, you're comfortable, but it's not a very good look. That God has called us to more. And Paul is saying, look, it's not going to always be comfortable. Why does he say you need to make room for the faults of others? Because we all have problems. We all have things we're working through. We're all works in progress. He says you're going to have to have grace with one another. You're going to have grace. He says, why does he say you're going to need to forgive one another? Because people are going to give you a lot of reasons to forgive one another. They're going to give you a lot of reasons to either choose bitterness or forgiveness. Paul says, look, this isn't going to be easy. We're going to have to work at peace. But this is what Jesus has called us to. And he says, remember the Lord forgave you. It's like Paul, at some point, somebody must have talked to him and sat him down and said, hey, Paul, you weren't there to hear this, but Jesus, before he went to the cross and before he rose again, he said that we need to love one another as he loved us. So it's almost like Paul got the memo on that and says, hey, you need to forgive one another like Jesus has forgiven you. He doesn't say, hey, look, when somebody offends you, you can just kind of ghost them. We don't get any permission to ghost one another. He says, no, we face one another because we fight for unity, because that is what makes the invisible God visible to this world. See, there are some things that God wants to do in the world that cannot happen through you alone as an individual. It can only happen together through us as a community. Some of us, we read Ephesians chapter 3, verse 20, and it says, I know the plan, or God says, Paul says that God has immeasurable and unthinkable plans. But often we read that as a promise to me as an individual. But you need to remember, Paul was not writing to an individual. He was writing to a community. That promise was not a promise for you alone. It was a promise for us together. And so if you're here and you're going, well, I haven't experienced the immeasurable, unthinkable things of God in my life, can I ask you, who else do you have around you? Because that promise was made for those in community. It was made for the church when they come together, that God says together we can do things that we would never see on our own, that together I can do the immeasurable and unthinkable through you. Which means this, if your theology allows you to separate yourselves from one another, if your theology allows you to just make distance from those that you don't like, to kick out those in your circle that you don't agree with, then your theology has a lot of work to do. Because the theology of God is He's bringing the whole world together. He's bringing the whole church together. And so He says we need to be united. In unity, it'll require us being unselfish. In unity, it will be uncomfortable, but here's what He promises, that unity will be uncommon. That if we can engage in unity, even when it's difficult for us personally, and even when it's uncomfortable for us, that if we can be united, Jesus assures us that unity, this sort of unity, will be uncommon. So 2,000 years ago in the deserts of Caesarea Philippi, Jesus cast a vision, and He cast a vision not for a place, but for a people. And I couldn't think of a better way to end this series, Uncommon, than coming back to this vision that Jesus cast. That He is not building a gathering, He's not building a service or an event or a program. He is building the gathering, the people. He's building a movement, and you and I are a part of it. And He prayed that we would be united. He prayed that we would one another, because when we do, it makes the invisible God visible to the world. And Jesus said that when this church was united under His name, Jesus assured us that not even the powers of hell would conquer it. Some of us may be here today, you've not really experienced the power of what Jesus promised because you're still an individual that attends a service on Sunday. You're just an individual that shows up on Sunday, sits in a seat, you leave, and you're like, but why aren't, it doesn't feel like there's much to this. Can I challenge you that perhaps the reason you're missing the power of what I'm talking about right now is you're still thinking as an individual as opposed to thinking as a brother and sister, a part of a family of God? What does that mean? It means instead of just showing up here, what does it look like to serve? What does it look like to give? What does it look like to participate in what God is doing in your church family? What does it look like to commit to being a part of this community even when the sermon isn't that good that week? Even when the music doesn't hit it maybe. Come on, are we going to be those people that are consumers or are we going to be creators? I believe God has called us to be creators of a future worth fighting for. Or are we going to be consumers that show up until the shine wears off and then we'll just go to a new place? If that's the way you navigate church, friend, I have just a kind of a guarantee for you. You're never going to experience what Jesus promised us. Because the promise of Jesus can only be found in unity, can only be found in committing to the church family. And we have 2,000 years of history to see what happens when the church unites. They become a head-turning, jaw-dropping, mind-blowing movement that disrupts empires and changes the world. And that happened because the early church fought for unity. The question is, will we? Will we fight for unity? Will we fight for unity even when it means being unselfish? Will we fight for unity even when it means we're uncomfortable? And can you imagine what could be possible for our church family if we got this unity thing right? So why did we do this series? Why this series Uncommon? Why spend 8 weeks talking about the Uncommon Church? Because what I wanted you to see is that the Uncommon Church captured the world's attention before. And I believe an Uncommon Church can capture the world's attention again. But we will only discover that together.